Now, there's my book.
And these are all things I make.
Oh, awesome.
There's my coloring book.
Hey, Jeff.
Woohoo! And you get all these things. So this book, it's a memoir, and it started primarily to answer the question, where am I from? Because when people ask that question, it's a long answer. And it's long because I grew up in Kenya to Chinese parents. There were very few Chinese in Kenya at the time, as one can imagine. I went to an international school, so those who grew up in Kenya say, well, what was it like in Kenya? Was it like this, that, and the other? It's like, no, I didn't have a Nairobi experience, I had an international school experience. Those who are Chinese say, oh, what the heck is that? Growing up in Africa, that's unheard of. Those who are Americans say, well, you grew up in Africa, you don't look African, what the heck is that about? So it's one of those things where it's hard to explain in a sentence or two or five exactly what that story is. So, if you've got 9 hours, I'll tell you the whole story. So, that was my motivation originally, but as I started writing, it emerged that there's more I wanted to say, and so in the book I go through the passing of my parents and how that went. My dad passed very suddenly, so that was definitely an adventure in itself, and I talk about that mind warp that happens when you find out a parent has passed, and I inherited the care of my mother who had Alzheimer's, so that was a ride in itself too. A whole year of my life is just gone because the care of her and still running my own acupuncture practice and all the staff needed to take care of somebody. It's amazing, actually. I did want to say one quick aside, and that is that if you can't take care of yourself, it's amazing how much staff you need to take care of others. So I always tell my patients, take care of yourself. It is taking care of others to take care of yourself. True, no? All right, the only other thing I wanted to add about writing this book was that I did have help. I hired a writing coach who writes short stories, and I really wanted that quality to the storytelling that brought you into that moment, because I feel like my memories, I'm sure your memories feel kind of like this. They feel like little flashes. They feel like a moment. It's sort of like these little bright images in my mind, and then the rest of my mind sort of fills in, like the part of the bright flash is an emotion and a certain kind of tension, and so the rest of the logical mind fills in, oh, that was such and such, it was approximately such and such age, it was so and so was there with you, and so happened, such and such happened afterwards, right? So there's the logical storytelling mind that kind of fills in all those details, but then there's the feeling, the color of that moment, that flash of a moment that we carry around, that I wanted to capture. So I felt like, at the beginning, they'd be a string of short stories that I would put together. And so that's kind of the quality of the book. It's definitely not told in a linear way. I've had people ask me, so is this from birth to now? And it's like, well, that's not really the way it's organized, but technically, yes. I mean, I do talk about some of my earliest memories, and I talk about all the way to moving to Myrtle Beach, but it's not told in a linear way. It's not told and then in 1983 I did such and such. So it's told in a way that's a little bit more thematic. So part one is a little bit more that question of where am I from. Part two is a little bit more about travel and some of the travel stories and giving you a feel for how I grew up, which is really on an airplane. Not because we were moving, but because we were traveling back and forth to China every 2 years. When I was between the ages of 3 and 18, we went on home leave every other year. So my dad working for the UN, that was one of the perks of the job. And he was a very patriotic, nationalistic sort of Chinese. He loved his country. And going back to China was a really big treat for him because he could do it in a way that allowed him to visit all the historically important sites in China, which is an awfully big country. So we did a lot of traveling. So I just give a taste in part two about travel and what that was like being a kid, doing all these crazy things. I'm gonna read from one chapter about Tibet. I was only 11 in Tibet at a time when it was just opened to visitors. So it's a crazy time, and I feel like in a lot of ways, I was too young to really appreciate it. But then again, it's a big part of my life just because it was so formative, in that particular way. Part three goes through my parents and the end of their life, and then I go back and I kind of rewind the clock and say, okay, let me explain. This is how my two brothers came into my life, and then I kind of go back and explore more the relationship to my mom growing up and my dad growing up, and finding out more about him and finding out more about both my parents after they passed, which is one of the things that I find in a way most sad, is that there's so much, the way I grew up, we really grew up not talking about anything personal. I mean, way not talking. I mean, I never got in trouble as long as I was fine. It was we didn't talk about anything. If I was out late, we didn't talk about it. If I was home fine, okay, we don't talk. So I don't actually even completely know what they know about how late I stayed out on a couple of my late night sorties in my teenage years. So it's kind of like that, so unspoken that it's actually it's a whole adventure in itself just to sort of piece together the detective work of who they were and then their lives before I came along, and the big contrast in a way to the very settled life that they had in Nairobi, Kenya, comparatively. So anyway, I was going to do a little bit of reading, if you're game. I'm going to start with a preface. The preface is a quote by Meher Baba, and it kind of gives a lot of perspective. When the goal of life is attained, one achieves the reparation of all wrongs, the healing of all wounds, the righting of all failures, the sweetening of all suffering, the relaxation of all striving, the harmonizing of all strife, the unraveling of all enigmas, and the real and full meaning of all life, past, present, and future. And that's a Bob quote. It's a very long sentence, but it says it all. Alrighty, so I was going to read this chapter on Tibet, and I was going to read another chapter that has an Indian accent that I could do for you. All right. Chapter 8, Tibet. The next home leave, 2 years later, and Dad has another exciting trip planned, an arduous journey to Tibet. Not that he's discussed it with me. Boarding a plane to Lhasa was unexpected, and I have had no preparation for what I'm about to experience. Flights have only recently been made available to tourists, flying out of Chengdu. To get there, we fly a small commercial prop from Beijing, the loudness of the engines leaving a dull roar in my ears as we manhandled our bags through the small airport. Dragging our luggage out to the tarmac for our next flight, my heart sinks. What we are to board looks like a retrofitted military carrier plane. Intimidated, I scale the ladder onto the plane. The seats are hard and flimsy, set up in short rows in an otherwise undecorated interior, bare metal walls and floor, no windows. The overhead bulbs stingily give away as little as possible. Gingerly finding our seats and strapping in, we are greeted by a stewardess doing her best to make the flight seem normal. Her fingers trembling slightly as she tucks her loose hair back into her tight bun. The inevitable time arrives to see whether this junker will fly. The engines crescendo into their all-commanding power, the metal sheathing protests in syncopated rhythms, and we feel the air catch and lift us beyond the limitations of land. Once you leave the plane, you may feel faint, lightheaded, or experience chest pains. This is because Lhasa is very high up, and the air is very thin. We have oxygen tanks for you. Please, let us know right away if you need assistance. The stewardess delivers the most unusual "you have landed" speech I have ever heard. Her voice is tinny after the long, deafening flight. Goosebumps from the cold, uninsulated plane showing on her bare forearms, but relief floods her face after the safe landing. With a little trepidation, I descend from the plane, acutely attuned to my breath. At only 11 years old, I have no idea what to expect. No pain, I note. Chilly, but I can breathe. Dad inspects me for a moment, his breathing equally unaffected. Nairobi is high also, about a mile high. Lhasa is double that, about 2 miles high, but we are probably more used to it than most, he said. Our small group deplanes slowly as an airport security guard points us towards 2 beaten-up Land Rovers caked with a generous topcoat of white dust. They are a familiar sight, as Land Rovers are also the favored vehicle for Kenyan safaris, though there the dust is red. As the smallest in our party, I am volunteered for the position of squeezing into the passenger seat amidst the heaped luggage of our cohort. A good thing, too, as I'm prone to backseat car sickness. Never a problem on a plane. But in a car, nausea can be uncomfortable enough that even my parents will notice and try to comfort me. From the looks of it, the ride is going to be dusty and hard, and I can use all the help I can get. Though it is just over a 2-hour drive, my mind processes it as an eternity. What passes for road in most places here is simply bare rock, newly hewn from mountainous plains that traverse between the airfield and Lhasa itself, wending a lifeless path in the dry, cold desert. Larger boulders throw me off my seat, a bag poking at me here or there as I land again, my stomach thankfully empty. Grabbing onto the door handle for support, I'm reminded of the jeep that took us to Lake Turkana in the north of Kenya. There, the road had also been merely a known trek over unadulterated volcanic boulders. The Tibetan driver occasionally gets chatty, explaining in poor English that the airfield has only recently been open to the public. Only a handful of hardy souls are even allowed to brave the primitive conditions due to the Chinese government's heavy-handed control over visitors to the area. That's rape, he suddenly spurts. Startled, I turn to find him gesturing to the swaths of bright green fields passing by out the window, plants stunted from the cold and altitude. I puzzle over this for some time. Years later, I discover that rape is an alternative name for rapeseed, a kind of canola. The driver refuses to stray from English, even at the attempts of Chinese from my father. Soon the road becomes too uncomfortable for anyone to speak, the clattering noise of our vehicle being too loud for easy conversation. Arriving at the guest house, battered and numb, we pile out of the Land Rovers, grunting and groaning and reaching for our respective suitcases. I help get our bags out, handing them to my parents, and noticing as I do a young Chinese man with a long neck and a prominent Adam's apple standing by to greet us. He is wearing a neatly pressed army jacket and a red-starred beret, but accompanied by regular slacks. In precise Beijing Chinese, he informs us that he is our cultural attaché. You must stay with me. I will be your guide while you are here in Lhasa. Please let me know if there's anything special you wish to see, and I will make arrangements. Tomorrow, we are planning a visit to the Patala Palace. Dinner will be in an hour. Wash up and get comfortable, but do not be late to dinner. We serve at only one time for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you miss a meal, it is not easy to find food elsewhere. Meal times are posted in your rooms. Dismissed. We are handed our room keys, leaving Mom, Dad, and I to grab our bags and find our bearings. In our room, the air is cold, as are the bare concrete walls, but the simple beds are nonetheless welcoming. It registers that the cot has been set up for me. I drop my bag on it and begin changing out of my dusty travel clothes. Behind me, I hear Dad muttering, "Cultural attaché, huh? Let's see what we can do to lose him." A little section break. The big room echoes with the susurrations of 100 bodies sliding onto the ground in their motions of devout prayer to the large statue of the Buddha sitting at the center of them all. The supplicants are men and women, though the majority are older women. They are dusty, hair clumped and greasy, dressed in layers of wool. They fill every space on the floor as we fill our own, a small band of tourists accompanied by the attaché. Oblivious to our stares, they are entirely absorbed in their own worship and prayer, lips moving, but with no conversation between them. I watch one woman in particular, her hands covered by cloth. Like all those around her, she kneels and places her hands flat on the ground, then slides her hands forward, leaning her weight onto them until her body is full length on the ground, her hands fully extended. The process is then reversed. Her hands are drawn back in, her body pushed into a kneeling position, and then a standing one, her hands brought together in a gesture of prayer. Over and over again, she repeats it in an endless cycle where time is meaningless. Everywhere I can see, thousands of devotees mirror the same motions at their own pace, in every direction, both inside the grand Patala Palace and all the way up the mountain path approaching this holy land. For hundreds of miles, devotees repeat this motion of prostration, then take a step closer to the goal and prostrate again. In other rooms filled with clattering prayer wheels, the devotion is different. Here, the devout mutter prayers as they walk alongside giant prayer wheels, pushing them around as they circumambulate. Many of them also carry small prayer wheels they can spin in their other hand. According to tradition, when spun, prayer wheels release anew the many prayers written or carved upon them. Walking back to the car in sober silence, I see thousands of prayer wheels of every size, pushed or spun by old and young alike. The Patala Palace seems bigger now that we have seen the inside. Driving up earlier, it appeared like a mirage, larger than seemingly possible, filling the entire space between two mountain peaks, and painted a brilliant white. After passing streets full of the ragged and unwashed masses, their skin darkened by exposure to both sun and bitter cold, the whiteness of the palace seemed like a mirage, rising out of the bare mountains. On our way back, the young, lithe attaché smiles at me in a friendly way, occasionally telling me a joke. Then he turns to the adults and earnestly lectures them on the official Chinese version of the history of Tibet. Every day, there are truckloads of Chinese families being relocated to Tibet to civilize the backward and superstitious people who live here, he exclaims proudly. We are bringing the principles of communist ideals to modernize and advance all parts of our progressive nation. As young as I am, having seen the markers of colonization in Kenya, I recognize it here. I want to like him, yet I know that the impoverished people on the side of the road, glaring in through the windows, are recognizing their oppressor. It is the first time I'm being identified as the colonizing race, and I am grateful for the glass that separates me from meeting their eyes. There's a little bit more. How are we doing? You want more of Tibet? Okay, good. A little scene change. My heart sinks from just thinking about the long, bumpy ride back to the airport. Thankfully, it is only our family slated to leave. No attaché, no other tourists to squeeze in with. Loading up the car, I sigh heavily, thinking about saying goodbye to the incredible mountains and unique people. It has been an eye-opening trip. At last, we climb into the same white Land Rover, the long, bumpy ride already giving me a spasm in my back. Trying not to miss anything, I focus on the people and scenery passing by. Life is rugged in these mountains. People we pass, men, women, and children, look uniformly grungy, their hair clinging together in dirty, unintentional dreads. Yet though their clothes are worn and dusty, they live with a dignity and integrity that are hard to describe. A tattered man, wrinkled before his time, with his child on a donkey, looks up unseeing as we pass. Just passengers in a big white car, intruders in the purity of the landscape. Static over the vehicle's radio has been sporadic and inconsequential up to now. Then, close to the airfield, the radio static turns to words of urgency. Picking up the handheld, the driver speaks Tibetan into the receiver, both voices increasing in volume as the dialogue continues. I look back at Dad, who is as mystified as I am, leaning forward trying to understand. Soon the driver, one hand on the radio, one hand on the steering wheel, looks back to face Dad as we careen over a particularly large bump. My eyes wide, I grab hold of the doorframe. Airport, no possible. Bad weather, no flight today. We go Shigatse. Questions begin to tumble out of Dad's mouth. How far is it? Where are we staying? After 10 minutes of effort, he realizes that the driver is only able to repeat the English he knows, leaving us almost completely in the dark. After a few more attempts, Dad gives up. Let's just see where it goes, he says to us, resigning us to our fate. Thankful at least that the road we've just turned down is smoother than the last, I spend the following half hour glued to the windows, trying to solve this new puzzle. By the time we pull into what looks like an army encampment, I'm entirely unnerved. Gesturing at the big green tent set in a circle, the driver motions for us to get out and start unloading, stepping out of the vehicle to presumably speak to whoever's in charge. Though my mind is still racing, something about the place tells me we will be safe. Not long after our bags are in our hands, a short uniformed man with a smiling mustache appears at a bow-legged trot. "Welcome," he says in Chinese, and then again in English, gesturing for us to enter the tall tent just ahead. "My name is Captain Tsering. Just call me Tsering." Inside are a set of low stools around a tall central wood stove, a circular galvanized chimney rising out of it. His warmth is reassuring. "Come, come," he says enthusiastically. "Welcome. Come sit here. Sit, sit." I sit on a low stool, Mom and Dad somewhat removed to my right on camp chairs. 3 or 4 men emerge from the corners of the room, nodding and smiling to us, and take their seats. Some I cannot see over the stove as they introduce themselves over the clattering of bowls and chopsticks behind us. Tsering offers me a warm bowl full of food, and I reach up to receive it, shooting a questioning look toward my dad, but he is already buried in his own bowl. I glance back up to Tsering in gratitude. His eyes are warm and reassuring, a cheerful smile on his face as he mimes an eating motion. Suddenly starving, I scoop a mouthful with chopsticks, even though I have no idea what I'm eating. It's good. After a few more scoops, a small empty teacup appears in my hand. Watching closely, I observe as Tsering pours a small dose of yak butter tea into his own cup. From there, he pours a little on the ground and tosses the rest up in the air behind him, a gesture to both heaven and earth. Then, with a cheerful commentary, he walks around the stove, filling every teacup. It's rich and smells incredibly strong. Too strong for me. I've seen people drinking it everywhere, and the attaché talked about it cynically, but this is the first time I'm tasting it. I can only take the smallest sip. It's bitter and salty and tastes that I'm not expecting. Hoping I'm not being rude, I furtively set it down on the floor beside me. I look but cannot see what my parents have done with theirs. Dinner settled, Tsering announces that it is traditional to sing when guests visit a Tibetan household. One by one, his men deliver beautiful ballads that my heart understands, even though I can't catch the meaning. Lost in the magic, my body warmed by both food and fire, I'm suddenly brought back by a sharp nudge on my shoulder. "Sing something," Dad hisses urgently. "It's our turn." Why me, I think. I look around at the men's faces, nervous to follow the depth of their beautiful sharing, racking my brain for a song. I land on Frère Jacques, a song I recently learned in my 5th grade French class. Frère Jacques, dormez-vous, dormez-vous. With a sudden spurt of fear, I realize I've forgotten the words to the next line. La 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 matina, la 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 matina, ding ding dong, ding ding dong. And then, feeling it's a little short, I repeat the words in English. Are you sleeping? Are you sleeping? Brother John, Brother John. Morning bells are ringing, morning bells are ringing. Ding ding dong, ding ding dong. I stop suddenly, embarrassed and not sure what to do next. And then all the men burst into applause and cheers. I blush deeply as they go around the circle again, singing more songs and sipping their after-dinner chang, a Tibetan version of beer. After the embarrassment of performing, I bask in the anonymity of their warm hospitality, the soldiers no longer curious about us or questioning our presence, our foreignness no longer an issue. How we doing? All righty, any questions? No questions, you know what to do. Carl.
What language did you guys speak at home?
Well, my parents often spoke to me in Chinese and I'd respond in English. The story's a little bit longer because it changed over time. My very first language was Mandarin Chinese, and my older brother, who passed, and that's in the book, he was very sick, so he'd go to hospitals and they'd speak English to him, and then he started school. So once he started school, he started speaking English at home. So then I just started speaking English. So my parents would try, they did their best. They would make every effort to keep up the Chinese. But after a while, it was kind of funny because I would actually hear my American accent, like my English accent, speaking Chinese, and I would just shut up because I could hear it. It's really weird, in your ear, you know what it's supposed to sound like, and what's coming out is like, that wasn't what it was supposed to sound like. So after a while, there was almost more embarrassment, and I would just not speak Chinese anymore. But the interesting thing is that my brothers, my 2 younger brothers, were adopted, and they were 1 and 3. So when they were adopted, I was 13 already. So they were speaking, and they understood Chinese. So that made me have to speak Chinese, and as I spoke more, my accent started to disappear. So they actually saved my Chinese.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a wild thing. Yeah.
I don't have a good time frame, but it seems like you would have been very young at the time, maybe, of the Cultural Revolution in China.
I wasn't alive for it.
You wasn't alive, it was over.
It was in the late 60s, if I remember. Yeah, I'm always fuzzy with dates, but it was a little before my time. I was born in 1971.
Yeah, so the China you knew was post-Mao.
The China I knew was in the 80s, pretty much. Yeah. I started going in the late 70s, but I don't remember that, you know what I mean? So, yeah, was there a comment? Oh, sorry. Question over there, Bobby.
Yeah, and what was your father's role in Nairobi?
Yeah.
Did you ever find out what he did?
Yeah, so My dad worked for the United Nations Environment Program, and he started very low on the totem pole. I think he started in New York as a translator. And I talk about in the book how he first started with the UN, and it was actually a patriotic reason. He started with the UN in 1972, which is just after China entered the United Nations, mainland China that is. They took over Taiwan's spot, and the Chinese government desperately needed anybody Chinese who spoke English to work for the UN. And the way the UN is set up, you actually have to have staff, not just as diplomats, but staff to staff all the different bodies, the UNEP, UNDP, WHO, UNICEF, all of those entities need staff, and different countries have to fulfill their quota of personnel. That's part of their donation, so to speak, their contribution to the UN. So that's how my dad started with the UN, was just out of patriotic reasons, and I'll explain that more in the book. But then he ended up with, my understanding is that it was a permanent contract that he ended up with, working for the United Nations Environment Program in Kenya, and so he rose up the ranks, and he ended up working for Infoterra, which is it's, I guess, a certain part or section of UNEP that interestingly dealt with how different countries handled environmental questions. So he was basically in charge of a database of how it is that different countries have answered questions that other countries might have about how to handle their environmental issues. So it continues to this day, of course, but yeah, it's pretty wild, because in a way, I didn't even know how cutting edge he was. He was totally an environmentalist, and I had no idea. You know how it is when it's your own parents. You're like, whatever. I had a question back here from Danusha first.
How long has this book called to you to be written, number one?
Yeah.
And then number two, now that it's complete, how has your life been transformed, and if so, how?
Yes. So I vaguely had the idea to write something down even from college, because when I first got to college, people would ask me, as a college freshman, well, what's your story? Where are you from? And all of that, I was totally dark from Kenyan sun, which I find amusing. There was actually people who used to think I was Native American. It was like, well, I guess, I was so dark. And we would avoid the sun. I mean, it's 2 degrees south of the equator, Nairobi is, but very high up. It's about a mile high. So sun is intense there. So I would get to college, I got to college, and they would ask me, and it was always this whole thing about like, okay, so what was that like? Did you have like, leopards in your backyard? And, no, I lived in the suburbs and I went to an international school. So yeah, it really is a little hard to explain in a few sentences where I'm from and how I grew up. And so it took a while before I really got serious about the idea of a book, but I've tried a few times and never really succeeded until last fall when I had some help. I hired a writing coach, and that's how it all happened. Has it changed my life? I did learn a lot of little things that I didn't expect to learn. It's kind of an interesting thing when you lay something out and you try to figure out, okay, how old was I at that time? What else was going on in my life at that time? What were my parents up to? And all those little details. It's kind of interesting because I had this flash of a memory that I remember being approximately 6 years old at the time. And it turns out that, well, I actually describe it in the book. It's a moment where my mom is standing in front of a mirror in the bathroom, and then I just have this vague flash that my dad was behind her, and they were looking in the mirror, and they were totally still, ashen-faced, just looking in the mirror and still, just like the lights of the bathroom glinting off of things. It's like that's the entire memory. And I had to piece it together what that was, and And what it was that was when my parents first heard that my brother had passed. So it's kind of like that, where, you know, my older brother, he actually died, yeah. So there's these little connections that until you kind of just sort through everything that you know about who you are, you don't necessarily put into a logical order until you actually do that. And then you start seeing connections. There's this other moment, it's a small one. I learned to make frogs in a nursery school in China, in Beijing. And I've never been put into a school before or since while my parents were traveling with us. That was, you know, part of my dad's joy was lecturing me about Chinese history. So he dragged me all over the place, you know. So this one time I was in a nursery school and I learned to make frogs, and I still make frogs, and I'll make you a frog if you want. And they jump, so it's kind of a fun little party trick. It's only when I put those two memories kind of in juxtaposition that I realized, wait a minute, that age-wise, that would have been the same summer right after my parents had lost I too had lost my older brother. And I, being young, I was pretty oblivious to the details of all that, but they would have been pretty distracted, and I can imagine why they would put me in a nursery school for that time, so they could kind of, you know, grieve and talk to relatives and what have you. So it's kind of this irony that I only put it together that I learned this particular skill from that particular summer. That would have been the way it was because, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like that. Yeah, it's interesting to write your own memoir. I think Corinne had her hand up. Did you? Oh, sorry. Pamela's next, sorry.
How did that happen to learn English? Or did you learn English in China?
Oh, well, my dad was, it's a long story with my dad, and you'll get more of the story in the book, but the short answer is that he ended up in New York, and he got himself, I think that he actually learned English in Taiwan. At that time, I see a lot of my mom and dad both had like collections of photos from people about the same age, which I then assume must be college photos. Because, you know, like they had these cute little, like, you know, headshot kind of photos to give to all their friends, I'm sure. And a lot of them are written on the back with an English name. So I think that they first learned English in Taiwan. I think that at that time it was a very modish thing to learn English, the American connection, Taiwan, all of that. And so my mom's name, Rosalie, is actually from back then. She said that a nun gave her that name. So it must have been like, you know, English class or something. So then he ended up in New York. My dad got himself into a PhD program in nuclear physics. And yeah, so he graduated with a PhD from Columbia, so definitely a smart man. So yeah, his English was awfully good. Had an accent, but it was good.
That's interesting. They were in Taiwan, but they worked from mainland Chinese government.
Oh yeah, that's a whole story. I have to explain that at length. So you have to read almost to the end of the book though to get that story. Just so you know. Okay.
Did you learn more about yourself in unexpected ways in doing the book and going through?
I feel like it did help me kind of digest all the stuff that happened in my childhood and the way that my parents were, and kind of like put that into a little bit more of a digested form, you know, it kind of helped me to coalesce that into something that I could rattle off in a sentence or two, right? But as far as learning about myself, I don't think that writing the book changed what I knew about myself. It just put things into more tidy order. It's a little bit like tidying up your workshop, you know, the stuff that's in it, you know it's there, but you may not be able to find it easily. So it's kind of like that, where it just sorted things out. So now at any point in time, were you to ask me for a 1-sentence or a 5-sentence version of my story, now I can tell it to you because I've sorted things out. I can find it. It's at hand. So in that sense, I don't know that I've learned anything new. I feel like I'm mature enough in my own life that I've figured out most of this stuff that I write about. But it's definitely a great process, and I don't think that anyone's ever too young or too old to write a memoir. I get that question. Are you old enough to write a memoir? If you're 20, you're old enough. I think there were some more hands up. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you have access to relatives or family friends if you had any questions?
I wanted this to be my version of events, so to speak. And certainly over the course of time, I've had a little bit of clues from relatives and what have you, but it's interesting because my mom's younger brother, when I ask him, he's very like, yeah, well, we were poor. It was Taiwan. And it's like, oh, how am I going to write a book on that, So it felt a little bit like to really be 100% factual about all the backstory and all the little details, it would take so much more than I was willing to give, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like, I felt like what I really wanted to do was convey my story, and then I could have a sequel or something along those lines to really piece together my dad's story or my mom's story potentially. And it's a little harder with my mom. She was much more obscure, I guess. Just she had her own world, and within that world she was completely confident and dominant. She was an artist, but outside of that, it was very hard to get any information, and her family is very hard to drag things out of. And it's weird because like they're perfectly friendly. It's just a very Chinese thing, I guess, or maybe not even only Chinese. I talked to a few people and they're like, oh yeah, well, my Irish bringing or my, whatever. They also feel that their parents just didn't reveal much. You get the other kind, right? The Italians that tell you too much, and then you get the other kind that's like, I don't know what to say. So yeah, I do feel like a lot of people do have access to their family, friends, and friends of the family, friends of their parents, and whatever, to get more of the version of their parents when they were young. But I didn't really have access to that growing up, and now it just feels even harder to reach because most everybody's in their late 70s. Yeah. Question? Yeah. It's a little bit more of the tension. The travel thing, first of all, I was never told what was going on, so I had to wing it, so there's that tension of like, seat of your pants, you're just managing, because you're just a kid, and like, my parents, they almost forgot about me until the moment when they wanted to lecture me about something, So that's the tension of it. So the unhappiness isn't that what I was seeing was so unwelcome. It was just the experience of being sort of dragged along, not consulted or set up. I think that people raise children so differently now anyway, but as a child, I was not given any sort of preamble or what to expect, and maybe they didn't completely know what to expect either, but at least they walked into it knowing that they were going to Tibet or wherever we were headed to. So there's a lot of the early memories of travel having that pull. And in retrospect, I definitely appreciate that I've traveled so much, because even though I was young, and darned it, I don't remember all the stuff that we did, and that's a bummer, it's still so formative to have that kind of upbringing where you are, the outsider, and you are kind of winging it, and you do have to kind of land on your feet and be social and find common ground with people. And I have a little synopsis about travel in that travel section in part 2, because there's a lot to be said for early travel, especially immersive travel, not just sort of like, be on a cruise ship and do some entertaining things. That's not the kind of travel I'm talking about. I'm talking about like immersive, really feeling like you understand a little bit of how people actually live other than the way you're living. And that is phenomenal to do at any age, but if you can do it early in life or force your kids to do it early in life, I highly recommend it. Much as they might complain.
Experience that some of them loved it and others just absolutely hated it.
I had the advantage that I was in one place, but all my fellow classmates moved. So although I had to make new friends all the time, because all my best friends would be like best friends for a year and they'd move on, or 2 years and they'd move on. It's a really interesting Facebook group that we have, the International School of Kenya graduates. It's like people are all over the place and you can't keep track of who's who, where's where, and what year were you? And did I really know you? And, yeah, we're in 3rd grade together. Like, okay, I don't remember that. So there's a lot of that where my friends moved, but I was in the same school. So I did have some advantage in that respect. Yeah, Carl.
How is it that the English you speak is not British English?
I went to an international school that was American run. It's actually
The American school.
It is.
Yeah.
It's an American school that it's actually owned by apparently the American and Canadian embassies, half and half. It's still a little fuzzy to me how that works, that an embassy can own a school, but that's how it is. So yeah, it was American teachers and an American curriculum with international baccalaureate.
Is it time to serve the yak butter tea yet?
Yes.
If you've never had it, it's an acquired taste.
It is an acquired taste, right? I don't even know what it tastes like anymore. I was so young, but I just remember I couldn't bear it. So I was only 11.
It's very sad.
Yes.
Are there more books to come? Surely with all this travel, there's got to be lots of stories that you can share with us.
It's an interesting question, right? Like, what do you write after? How do you write a sequel to a memoir? There are other stories and there are other small moments, but I think that I covered all the big things. So if it were a future memoir style book, it would have to be honing in on maybe a more particular time and being more detailed even. So yeah, it's an interesting question. What do you do after a memoir? I actually hope to write some acupuncture books, which is an entirely different genre, of course, but acupuncture for the layperson. So helpful things, practical things that, stretches to do for low back pain with some breathing exercises and, more of a Chinese point of view on things, and my own experience, of course, thrown in. But that's a very different genre, so.
Different kind of background in the person.
I think that the advantage of the way that I grew up is that I really was, the disadvantage is that I was outside of everything, but the advantage is that I am outside of a lot of the way that people grow up inside a box. Not everyone here, but like a lot of people grow up with a mindset of, do what everybody else does, what will the neighbors think, what do you mean you don't know how to do such? Everybody knows how to do that, So growing up outside of that means that I have a perspective that is more of the observer, which I think does lead to more of a automatically meditative stance in terms of, being a little bit removed from all the little drama that life is. So that means that life is a little lighter because you're not so tied into the way it has to be, because it doesn't have to be that way, and I know that for a fact. I feel like it leads to more creativity because, creativity is technically anything that's outside of the box, right? So that's how I grew up. I grew up entirely outside the box. I don't think inside the box. I don't know what the box is. I never was given a box, so nobody gave me a box. So yeah, I feel like the ultimate bottom line of of the way I grew up is that really all humans are the same. You go anywhere in the world and you really hang out with them, and yes, all the stuff on the outside is different. Like, oh, here it's taboo to point your finger this way, but there you can't sit with your legs facing a certain way, and over here you can't, you can't leave your chopsticks stuck in the vise. Oh no, don't do that. But ultimately, those things are so superficial compared to what are people really looking for. They're really looking for happiness and love and relationship. And if you can just see right through the heart of that, there's no difference whatsoever. There's nothing to discuss at all. You got nothing more to say. It's just a love connection that is way more real than all the little things. And in a lot of ways, we vaunt culture, but what is culture but the learned knowledge of a people over the course of time? Some of that is learned and not necessarily useful, and some of that is learned and really, really a lot of fun. So, part of me, I got all this education. I definitely am all for knowing the right culture, but at the same time, it's just a human artifact, ultimately. You know what I mean? The real nature of what was happening, what was transpiring, is some element of love exchange. So I feel like I automatically gravitate towards Baba's message that God is love and all we're here for is love, and love must love. So let's get to loving. Alrighty.
You should write a song like that.
Oh yeah. That's my next song. My next hit.
I really like your cover.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know who designed that, but it's nice.
I had a designer that I found online who gave just the image of a woman with an umbrella facing an Asian scene. It was like a Thai temple, and it was sort of like that. And I thought, well, I like the umbrella, and I need Savannah, I need Kenya, I need, So I worked with him a lot back and forth. So ultimately, I feel like I designed it, but he was my hands. So yeah. Yeah, I think it's time for some refreshments. Yes? Any more questions? Feel free afterwards. Yay. Thank you so much for coming. Yay!